Good morning, Vin. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. And yourself, Tia?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for joining us and thank you for kind of breaking down a little bit about the financial markets as they relate to cannabis. One of the things I wanted to make sure I didn't butcher your last name. How do you say your last name?
Maru.
Vin Maru. So,
Yeah.
Vin, how did you get involved with cannabis to begin with? Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. I started in the tech days back in the 90s, and I saw that as a big emerging trend with the internet, really at the early stages of it becoming mainstream. And I got involved in there doing media work and stuff like that. Then the dot-com boom bust happened. And, you kind of look back on what just happened there after seeing all these stock prices rise and just being working in the space doing media work. But I moved on and stopped doing work for clients, and then kind of got back into my financial background. I had a university degree from in business, but mostly primarily focusing on finance, and always had a passion for the stock markets and investments. So I kind of dove back into it, and I got introduced to precious metals in 2005. And so I really dove into it, started doing some media work, started understanding why the precious metal sector was increasing in value and rising, and got a firm grasp of the monetary system as we see it today and how it's been set up with central banking and fiat currencies and stuff, and drove me into the precious metal space. So I was involved in precious metals for 7, 8 years until they rose in price, and then there was a bust that happened in 2008, and then 2011 that peaked. So after being involved in there, during that time I started speaking at precious metals conferences. I was writing a newsletter at the time talking about investment opportunities in the space. But 2011 came, the precious metals died, and so I was kind of looking for other opportunities. So I seemed to find these major trends early enough and get involved in the space at early stages. And so in 2013, I was at a trade show here in Toronto. That's where I'm outside of Toronto right now. And there was a gentleman franchising a cannabis facility. And I go, what? They're legalizing this or commercializing it? So I started learning about it right then. And right then and there, I knew right away this was a much bigger industry that was going to be evolving than any other industry I'd already seen in the past, because most other industries were already developed out. And, cannabis was an industry that was there underground, let's call it, or in the gray market, but it never became commercialized. And so I realized from that point on, this was going to be a major opportunity, for investing, but business opportunities, bringing cannabis out of the gray area into a legal market, and overall really healthy for the industry and for cannabis users, consumptions, all of that. Having a new approach to how cannabis is perceived. And so from that point on, I just kind of dove right into the cannabis space, didn't even think about it or any hesitation. I really kind of started evaluating the companies. It was in Canada, so they were talking about commercializing and legalizing the industry. So I realized that right from the get-go, the first publicly traded company that would come out in Canada was going to do amazing. So in December of 2013, I heard about Canopy and them raising capital and getting their license. And then I kind of did a bit of digging around into who put the deal together and who's involved, and ties with politicians and all of this. But they were getting backing by the financial brokers, and at that point I realized, wow, this is going to be the leader in the space, let's call it. But from then on, I started evaluating a lot of other companies in the space, started investing myself, wrote about it, and spoke about it at various conferences. So
Perfect.
that was my journey into the cannabis space.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Now, you mentioned Canopy Growth, and we've actually had Bruce Linton on the show already. Tell us a little bit more, because their stock did skyrocket and then it had a retraction, not so much so as some of the other larger cannabis companies that we see on the stock market today. But can you kind of talk talk to us through the journey and what your, I guess, what your recommendation would be really for people that are investing in the stock market right now that are focused on cannabis, just because I think all the stocks have been hit pretty hard in the past year.
Yeah, well, they definitely have been hit hard. Some have lost 80-90% value. Canopy has done actually quite well in terms of the stock price retracing back. Being the leader in the space with the highest market cap, the biggest traction, it was probably going to lose the least amount out of this. And why we kind of had this whole, let's call it the cannabis crash, it was actually very easy to see and predict, because if you understood the cycles of investments, you had broker money putting capital to work early stages 4 or 5 years ago. Then, in Canada, we had legalization happen in October of 2018. These company stock prices were rising because they were just talking deal flow and acquisitions, and the hype was coming in and around Canada legalizing recreationally. You knew there was a ton of investment interest in this space as legalization approached. But that, when you get that much positive inflow of capital, at some point that does reverse, and they call it baked in the cake or something like that. So Canopy, as well as all of the other companies, really their upside was at the most when they had legalization happen, and after. At that point, the market would have disappointed. Like, if your earnings weren't there, they weren't gaining traction, and investor fatigue was another big thing. The stocks were bound to sell off. It's like a big bubble that burst. So when I look at some of the companies now and I look at evaluating them, whether they're a good buy or not, which companies will survive this cannabis crash that we're in, you almost have to take a look at where the stock prices of these companies were at their peaks
Right.
in the last year, and then where they are now. The ones that retraced the least or didn't lose as much, those are probably going to be the leaders coming out of this bottoming sideways pattern that we're in right now. So Canopy is definitely, I would say it probably lost about 60%, or sorry, yeah, about 60% of its value. But some of these other companies lost a lot more than that. So, in Canada, I think Canopy's stock price was at $65 as a peak price, and then it retraced to just around $20 and around 26 or whatever it is. So it's one that you would obviously want to pay attention to because it is the leader in the space in Canada. There's several other companies that also have done, their stock prices have retraced, but they will also survive this shakeout. But I am fearful for a lot of companies that are not capitalized. They don't have backing by institutional fund managers. And if they're not able to raise capital in the next year, many of these companies are going to go bankrupt.
Right. What are your thoughts on Aurora? Speaking of losing a lot of value.
Yeah, Aurora is another one. And I'm just I'm just pulling up the stock price right now just to get an idea. It had in the US, it was almost $12 stock price at one point. It's $1.74. What I'm doing right now to evaluate these companies is not so much what they're doing. Aurora just actually announced asset sale today. I saw a press release from them. They're selling one of the greenhouse facilities that was acquired through MedRelief. It was acquired for $26 million. They're trying to sell it for $17. They're just trying to get cash rich. They sold off their position that they had in T-God, the Green Organic Dutchman, back in September. So most of these companies are scrambling, but to stay afloat, Aurora will probably survive the shakeout that's coming just because of the pure size of the company and the support they have. But, they're at a point right now where their stock price should get some support in this range. So on a technical chart basis, yeah, I could see it going to $1.35. It's at $1.74 right now, US. but I wouldn't expect it to get much higher than $1, 2.50, 2.60. So what I see happening is all of these companies are going to enter kind of a sideways trading range. So the bottoming pattern has happening or is happening, and we've seen the bottoms or very close to it. But I suspect these stock prices are not going to rise anytime soon. And so, yeah, you would look at Aurora. They're a big company in Canada. So they will get support at some point. I don't suspect they're going to go bankrupt by any means, but um, I just kind of have a feeling that investing in the space right now, it's probably wise to have a wait and see approach,
Right.
and go from there.
And if people are already invested, just hold at this point?
Well, that's a tough decision, and because I've gone through investment cycles before, and the best time to get invested in any industry or any sector that's starting to take off is early stages. So, like if you had invested in cryptos back in earlier in the decade, they ran up and they crashed. Now they could go sideways. So, what there is a thing called is when you have this bubble and then rising and then the burst happens. Yeah, the stock prices have come down. Investors may have lost a lot of money, but there is a thing called dead money. And if the stock price does not go anywhere over the next year or two, which I suspect will happen in cannabis, then you're not really making a return on that money. Now, people may have lost a lot of money if they bought in the last year and holding on to it. But if the objective is to actually making money and investing, you're sitting on dead money and where and when you'll recover those returns is very tough to say. But I would almost suspect that this cannabis stock prices are not going to go anywhere in the next year or two. So if you have other opportunities to invest that capital, it's up to you, but you may want to take the loss just so you can find something else that is rising in price or another sector or an industry that is hot and has a potential, increase in value 100 or 200%.
I see.
But that being said, sorry, go ahead.
I was just curious if there are any areas that are cannabis adjacent that might be hot.
Well, that's the next area that I'm looking at. So years ago, when I first got into the cannabis space, I kind of said, everyone's going to pay attention to the cannabis sector in terms of medical and recreational. It's going to take about 5 years. And it was about 5 years. I started in 2013, it's 2019, but 2014 was really when the cannabis stock started raising capital, facilities were being built. So it was a 5-year cycle, and now it's bust. Now, when I dove into the cannabis space, I realized back then that hemp had the potential to be a much bigger industry than cannabis as we know it, which would be for medical recreational. But I knew back then that hemp wasn't going to get the traction. It was like cannabis for medical and rec was going to get the spotlight. But I always believed back then that hemp would be a much bigger industry than cannabis as we know it. And but I did realize that no one was going to pay attention to it, and it would take 4 or 5 years before it started gaining some traction. So, CBD has been a big topic of conversation in the last few years, especially as people are realizing the benefits of the various cannabinoids, and so with the 2018 Farm Bill, now the focus has been in the past year a lot of people jumping into cannabis space, but more so on the farming side for CBD. So I think the investment opportunities are there for CBD and for farming, but I think people are underestimating the size and the scope of what the industrial hemp industry could be. So just as much as I realized cannabis was going to be a big industry 6 years ago, and it was a new emerging industry coming from the underground with tons of potential, I firmly believe that industrial hemp has the same potential, if not a lot more. So a year and a half ago, I spoke at one of the conferences up here in Canada And that was really kind of the first person I knew of that was talking about industrial hemp.
Mhm.
And back then I called it the $1 trillion industry. And even to this day, I still firmly believe that industrial hemp has the potential to be $1 trillion industry, which would be much bigger than what we know cannabis could be for medical or rec. I mean, the numbers there are saying it's $100 billion industry, depending on which report you read. But I still believe that hemp, it can be much bigger, and it's still emerging. It's a brand new industry that has to be built out from scratch. So it's not like you're investing in, the automotive industry or the airline or the financial services. This is an industry that is going to be built from scratch and has the potential to be much bigger than many other existing industries out there.
Now, hemp looks like it will have different business dynamics, as it seems like it will be a commodity crop. Is that an accurate perception?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we are, at the end of the day, hemp is going to have two sides to it. So I've seen people talk about rules, regulations around hemp farming, but I don't think they're clarifying it effectively, because there's going to be an industry for hemp that's growing it for CBD. And then there's another side of it, which is industrial hemp. So I think when we start talking about rules, regulations, they're going to have to differentiate between the two various subsectors, let's call them. And so each of those will have its own dynamics, its own opportunities, its own processes, and capital flow into it. So we've seen a lot of capital come into hemp for CBD side. There's the other side, which is the industrial hemp side. But yet, at the end of the day, it is a commodity, an agricultural commodity. So you do have to treat this like an ag business. But once you've got hemp for CBD, for example, is grown, and I believe it should be done organically, but once it's grown, it's processed, dried, and extracted, then you're pretty much done. The industrial hemp, even though you're growing hemp for industrial purposes, you're going to be growing it probably a little differently than you would for CBD. At the end of the day, it starts off as an agricultural commodity. You're growing hemp for industrial purposes, so you're just trying to grow as much stock and fiber as you can. But from there, you're going to have an industrial component to the industry. So you're going to take that stock, and once it's harvested, and let's say it's baled up, you've got to now think of that industry as an industrial manufacturing and processing business, because you're going to take that baled stock, debale it, process the stock, so that way you're separating the fiber and the cord. And then from there, you're going to be supplying pretty much thousands of other products that can be made out of industrial hemp, which would really disrupt lots of different industries like the woods, the plastics industry, paper industry. We know that there's thousands of potential uses for hemp. So as a commodity, and coming from a resource background from mining and space, I understand commodities quite well. That once you have that raw material of the fiber and the cord, and you can start utilizing that to make thousands of different products, you're going to have to start incorporating all existing businesses that potentially could use hemp as a raw material input for their manufacturing. Starting to have conversations with these companies about what they could do to start using hemp in their existing manufacturing processes versus the other materials that they currently use.
So is that process of pivoting from cotton to hemp, or from, let's say, wood to hemp, is that a difficult technological process, or is it a simple integration of hemp into that supply chain?
I think there's technologies out there that are starting to evaluate how you can do it. There's bioplastic companies that are looking at it. Actually, I'm going to be speaking with one very shortly. that's something, I'm diving into in terms of my research is how viable these existing industries, how viable is it for them to be able to use hemp in their existing manufacturing processes? So, for example, the wood industry, the paper industry, rope manufacturing, cotton industry for t-shirts, those technologies are already there for hemp use. I think it's just for them, it's about educating the global marketplace why we should be using um, hemp fiber and cord for the raw material inputs because it's more eco-friendly, and for cotton industry it uses half as much water for processing because cotton is absolutely the worst polluter of water right now. And so those kinds of industries, it could be very easy to migrate and start using hemp as for with raw material inputs. Now, construction industry, I'm starting to see a lot of information about hempcrete being used, but I think there's also a lot of studies that have to be done, and then approvals from various regulatory agencies to actually have hempcrete used as a kind of a common material to replace concrete. So it's definitely on the radar. But what I do find exciting is some new innovation and technologies that are coming in with the use of hemp and carbon and the fiber materials. Like I've seen and heard battery technologies being created with hemp, and other innovations. So it seems like having hemp with other materials, and including even CBD, which is why I think demand for CBD is going to continue to rise. You're starting to see that CBD, if it's an if it has electrical conductivity properties in our endocannabinoid systems, well, it seems to have some sort of electrical property where you can actually make battery technology with it. And so I would almost think we're on this whole new era and a cusp of identifying and using these materials from the hemp plant to be able to create technologies the world's never even seen yet. So, for example, if the battery technology becomes economically viable and it's very close to lithium grade, which I'm hearing it already is, then there's no point in mining lithium from the ground when you can actually grow hemp and use all of it to make battery technologies to help grid level storage solutions and all the store stuff. So, or even right down to nanoparticles of wafer boards and stuff like this. What really excites me is we know there's thousands of potential uses of the raw materials from the hemp plant to make different products, goods and services, the papers and all of this stuff. But there's this whole subset of technology and product innovation that I believe will come out of the hemp space, and that's the vertical niche that I think I'm excited about the most.
So, aside from versatility of the hemp plant, obviously it can be used as a food source, it can be used as a medicinal plant, it can be used for a variety of industrial purposes. What really makes it attractive is that it grows fast, it's pretty pest resistant, and it's cheap to grow. Is that pretty much what would make it a really great commodity for industrial usages?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just even from the perspective of wood material, takes 20, 30, 50, 100 years for these trees to grow. You can grow a hemp plant and a crop within 3 or 4 months. If you're in the right climate, you can get 2 to 3 grow seasons a year. So just from that perspective, it makes absolute sense to start looking at using hemp. Now, the other reason why I think industrial hemp is also going to be a booming industry is the world is talking about climate change and becoming more eco or quote unquote green friendly. Well, I can't really think of any other plant out there that can be grown very quickly, pretty much in a lot of different climates. I can't say everywhere, but I mean a lot of different areas, and be used there. I mean, one of the people I've spoken around the world is talking about ag land and how there's just so much pesticides, and the nutrients are been pulled out of the ground. He's thinking there's going to be shortages of high quality agricultural land. And I go, well, that may be the case, but if you actually start growing hemp there and, replowing that back in, adding in nutrients, pulling out the toxins, which hemp does, then, in a 5-year window, the shortage of the potential shortage for agricultural land can be remediated with hemp. So I would be tempted to say that hemp should be grown everywhere and globally. But China is the biggest producer of hemp. They do it mostly for the cotton industry. But so when we talk about an industrial hemp industry, at the end of the day, it is a game of numbers. And if you have countries around the world that can grow it cheaper and process it cheaper and make their finished products and goods from it, that's where the industrial hemp industry will most likely migrate. Canada, US, we have a much higher cost infrastructure, so I really question how much industrial hemp is, or how much hemp is going to be grown for industrial use when we have actually lost our manufacturing base to countries like China and Southeast Asia and Central America and stuff. So, but at the end of the day, I mean, whether we bring back those manufacturing jobs into North America and have it based on hemp or not, hemp is still a great crop to grow if you're just talking about cleaning up lands and stuff like this, or just adding nutrients back into the land, and then going from there. So, carbon emissions, it sucks up a lot of carbon. So the benefits of growing hemp outweigh any economics of it. So it would be something where I would say, people really like to see the economics of things to justify growing or diving into a brand new industry. To me, it wouldn't make any difference. I would say still grow hemp. And even if it means just growing it to add nutrients back into the soil, or cleaning up bad ag land, or helping with carbon emissions and stuff like that.
Okay. So you see kind of a migration of maybe industrial hemp to Southeast Asia and potentially Central America, where it's cheaper to grow, and potentially importing it back into North America.
Well, listen, I think the global economy is set up this way. We don't really manufacture much in North America anymore. It's all been outsourced. So it would make sense that these countries that have access to a cheaper labor pool, because it's processing and growing and processing hemp, it's still very labor intensive. I think there's going to be lots of automated processes that are developed over the coming years, but nonetheless, manufacturing seems to still reside within the cheapest labor pool. And whether that changes in the future or not, sure. But at the end of the day, I would still be tempted to say that hemp should be grown globally. And then if you had an ideal economy, you would actually take that hemp material, the raw, the fiber and the core, and then produce locally. I mean, if it's grown locally, why not produce locally? And then have these micro economies in and around hemp. That makes sense, but we'll see how it develops over the coming years.
Right. So it seems like there's a lot of need for infrastructure support and infrastructure building at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of the biggest challenge I see, even with CBD and hemp being grown for it. When I saw people talking a lot about growing tons of hemp, especially with the passing of the Farm Bill in the US, and how much hemp was actually planted in the ground by all these farmers that were misinformed or not educated on what it would take to grow hemp for CBD. And there was a number out there I've seen that was supposedly there was about $8.5 billion worth of crop that had been planted. In theory, if they would have cropped out, then it would have been worth 8.5 billion, but 7.5 billion of it went to waste, didn't get processed. So the infrastructure was never there. for such a large scale farming of hemp for CBD, because no one thought through the harvesting side of it. The drying was a big challenge, and then the extraction side of it. It was never, everyone jumped into it with the promise of making $20, $30, $40,000 an acre, but not realizing the amount of time, energy, costs, and the infrastructure required to make that happen. So that was on the CBD side of it. Industrial hemp, I think, is going to go through those same growing pains, because at the end of the day, it's one thing to take a field of hemp down, let it red out on the field so the fibers break down and stuff, but you still have to process that material, and with special equipment, to be able to do it on scale, to be able to supply an industrial hemp industry. And the big challenge is that processing capacity, or the machinery, the infrastructure is not in place. In fact, the machinery to really process hemp the right way, it really doesn't exist to do it on scale. I mean, I know guys that are building the machines. I'm actually working with a company to design and develop a farm or a factory level solution for processing hemp. But it's tinkering and toying with equipment until you actually get it figured out, and then have pretty much a factory assembly line processing solution and that's what's got to get built before we really have a thriving industrial hemp industry. So all of those things are sort of in the early stages of being developed. Having the best practices, having the processing capacity. At the end of the day, I tell people, they talk about industrial hemp. Well, planting seeds, letting it grow in the soil, farming it is not the challenge. And maybe finding an end buyer who wants to use hemp for the paper industry or replacing cottons, once the economics show that it's very viable to replace those commodities with hemp, that's not even going to be the challenge. The biggest challenge and the bottleneck of having a viable industrial hemp industry is in the processing. And until that's addressed and can be done on scale, there's no point in growing millions of acres of hemp for industrial uses. And industry that existing manufacturers that could in theory use that hemp, they should start to pay attention to it, because I think this is a game changer and it could be disruptive to their existing businesses. But right now, the big bottleneck is processing, whether it's at the farm level or at the factory level. And I'm working a lot on identifying the opportunities, the challenges, what's going to be required, and talking to groups of people and companies about building factory level solutions for processing hemp. So that's, once that bottleneck is addressed, then we can start talking about growing millions of acres of industrial hemp, and then start talking to big industry about using hemp. So
interesting.
it's
Yeah.
it's like the chicken and the egg scenario. You can't really have one without the other, but the biggest thing is the bottleneck is in the processing. And that's
Right.
what's got to get addressed first before we really have a thriving hemp industry. So when I say hemp has the potential to be $1 trillion industry, I firmly believe that it does, and it will be much bigger than what most people think it could be, but that's going to take decades to get there.
Decades, not even years.
No,
Wow.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, and these numbers are not exact, but here's my rationale of why I believe hemp has the potential to be $1 trillion industry. So you take global GDP, and I've heard numbers 80 to 100 $1 trillion as the global GDP. So that's all goods and produced in globally. If it is $100 trillion, let's just assume it's $100 trillion yearly. And out of that $100 trillion, to make up that $100 trillion, you have all these raw materials, inputs, manufacturing, all of it that makes up that $100 trillion. Well, those raw materials and inputs that make up that global GDP, you could assign a number of, let's say 10% of the global GDP is these raw materials and manufactured goods. that in theory hemp could replace. So if all those raw materials to make up the $100 trillion industry, or not the raw materials, just the manufactured goods, to make up that $100 trillion industry, even if it was, say, 10% of it, now you've got a $10 trillion industry of manufactured and raw material inputs. Well, if you could migrate over the next decade or two, if you could migrate 10% of that to a hemp-based input, so like the cotton industry or the plastics or the woods, if you can take 10% of that $10 trillion that's input and migrate it to a hemp-based input, there's your $1 trillion industry. So that will take a while to get there because you still have to address the bottleneck of processing on scale. Now, some materials, like if you're making chipboards for burning, you don't really need specialized equipment for that, but you still have to do it on scale. So if you can have a $1 trillion industry and make it viable, I still firmly believe you're talking billions upon billions of dollars that have to come into it to even get the $1 trillion industry over the next decade. So, for example, we keep hearing that cannabis is going to be $100 billion industry, and that's for medical rec. Well, how many billions have already gone into the cannabis space for building cultivation facilities and all of the rest of it? And the billions are high. I mean, it's not tiny numbers. I don't have the exact number, but I suspect there's probably been about $20 to $30 billion of capital that's probably been put to work so far to make up $100 billion industry. So for example, if it took $20 billion to have this $100 billion viable industry, then and if hemp has the potential to be a $1 trillion industry, well, that 20% ratio, you're talking about $200 billion that in theory needs to come into hemp to have a $1 trillion industry. So there's a ton of capital that has to be come into the space, put to work, and really make a viable industrial hemp industry. But when that happens, we are talking about a global game changer of a brand new industry that really touches on every aspect of every industry out there, including eco-friendly solutions and cleaning up the environment and becoming green and carbon emissions and all of this other stuff that's going to come down the pipe because of the benefits of hemp. So we're talking big numbers. It's usually a long time frame for these kinds of things to develop. So, for example, any emerging industry like tech, you had computers back in the 60s and 70s, but it was really until the 90s that they became main products that everyone started using. So in the business world, it seems like the business cycle, it takes anywhere from 20 to 30 years for mainstream adoption to happen. So TVs were available, sure, maybe in the 50s or 60s, but it really wasn't until the 70s and 80s that everyone had a TV or access to a TV. So I think we're at that same point where now that hemp, the industrial hemp industry is going to get a lot of traction. Starting now, it takes 5 to 10 years to build out the supply chain and start making it viable, and then another 5-10 years of main adoption from other industries that could use hemp to replace their existing raw materials. So I suspect by the time in the next 20 years, will we get to $1 trillion industry? I believe so. I hope it's earlier, but being realistic, that's usually timeframes that are needed for these kinds of major disruptive opportunities to take hold and produce a strong foothold. So,
Do you feel advances in AI or robotics can compress that time?
Yeah, absolutely, especially on the processing side of it. The robotics, the automation of processing at the factory level will definitely speed up the processing side of it. Artificial intelligence, eventually it may come into play, but at the end of the day, what we are talking about that's required right now is tons of engineering and designing and people that have built factories and processes. That's, these are man hours of experience that people have built these sort of things, that's required to make that factory happen. Then, just like every other factory that's being automated, once we have once we have the basis of this developed at the factory level, then you can start bringing in the technology to really make it a lot more efficient. So just like anything, it's all about economies of scale. If you have to, if you're introducing a new technology or a new product or goods or service, it's generally a lot more expensive in the early stages. But once it starts getting the adoption and you start building economies of scales, then it can really start to become economically viable. So, for example, I'd love to see some numbers. I haven't seen it just yet. I'm still looking for all these numbers. Is, what does it cost to make a yard of cotton versus a yard of hemp, and will people accept that? And so these are kind of numbers and data points that I'm starting to dive into to look for, just to see how viable it will be. But technology, I do believe, is going to play a big part of it, let alone the fact that hemp can be used to make technology products. Like, one of the things I'm bullish on, and I think it has a great potential in the future, is 3D printing. Now, if you can, instead of using the plastic materials that's used for 3D printing, if industry finds out a way to use hemp as a replacement for the plastics, well, I mean, there's a whole subsector of the industry that'll have, that'll be amazing to see happen. So I believe there's going to be lots of room for technology and innovation to come into this space, more so than most other sectors, because I mean, we've built computers out for a couple decades already. Sure, they're getting faster and stuff, but at the end of the day, computers still doing the same job. Whereas industrial hemp has the potential to disrupt a lot of existing industries. Now, when I say disrupt, though, I've had this conversation with others that keep telling me, there's gonna be challenges and people won't allow you to displace the lumber industry and all of this. And I go, there's no point in trying to disrupt these existing industries. So if we already have a plastics industry, if we already have wood, lumber, paper, all of these other factories and businesses are already established, and they have a foothold. The best opportunity is for them to start migrating towards hemp-based raw material inputs. So it's not like hemp is going to disrupt these existing industries, and it probably doesn't make sense to disrupt them, but maybe use the hemp products, the raw materials, to replace their existing businesses, because we already do have. Globally, we do have great infrastructure. We have best practices for manufacturing. We have supply chain. We have, most of all of these other existing industries are operating at a very efficient level. All we need to do is get them to start focusing on seeing how they can mitigate their footprint in the world and become more green friendly, and start looking at hemp as part of that solution, and then migrate their existing businesses. So it's, people are fearful that it's going to disrupt other industries and there's going to be backlash and lobbying against it and all of that. And I'm saying, well, it doesn't necessarily have to go that way. If we can just work together with existing industries and migrate them, then that's a great opportunity. But I think what needs to happen right now, more so than anything else, is tons of education and sharing information on why hemp is a better alternative to existing materials and inputs that we already have.
Fascinating. So for the investors that are out there that are looking for areas of opportunity, it looks like the hemp industry, it might be too early to really invest in this space. Is that accurate?
Well, yes and no. Just like any emerging industry, it is early, but if we know it has this potential to be a $1 trillion industry, and it makes all the sense in the world from a green perspective to move towards hemp, then the capital should start coming in right now. I think it just because just like we've had this big rise in the cannabis stocks and tons of interest over the last 5-6 years come into the space, and now it's a bust. Well, there are lots of companies that are brokerages or investors that made a lot of money, and maybe they were wise enough to cash out, realizing booms and busts happen as part of the business cycle, and they're looking to deploy that capital to put it to work, let's call it, in new areas that have upside. Does the cannabis sector, as we know it for medical and rec, have upside? Marginally, sure. But the last thing I want to look at is another company looking to raise $20-30 million so they can build a cannabis facility. We've been there, we've done that. It does not excite me anymore. So I think the industrial hemp has 10 times more potential as a real industry, and we're still early stages. I mean, so that capital is going to come in, and it should. I mean, it makes more sense to me than investing, 20, 50, or $100 million to build out a new facility. I would say, give me $100 million and I'll start building out an industrial hemp that will turn into a $1 trillion industry at some point. So when investors realize that potential, I think the capital flow will come into the space. And listen, at the end of the day, business cycles happen, booms and busts happen. They happened in every other industry, whether it was tech, resources, cannabis. Those are the main ones I followed. But automotive, you name it, electronics, they all had their booms and busts. Industrial hemp is going to have their booms. It's going to have a boom and a bust. But we're not even at the start of the boom phase. So if you really want potential for investing and having that opportunity where you can make that 10, 20, 30 bagger, what they call them, 20 or 30 times your money, really, the only thing I can see that's left out there is the industrial hemp space. Because even if you look at crypto and blockchain, when I looked at Bitcoin, we were talking about it with some people that was writing newsletters and investment talk about. They were looking at it at $10. Now it went to $19,000, and that's a fluke, but it's rising. I'm very bullish on blockchain technologies. The crypto space itself, I don't know, but you've already had that rise at the boom and the bust from an industry or emerging technology that came from really ground floor, zero value to something that went to $19,000. Well, so that's been played out. What I'm saying is, my belief is that the industrial hemp is still at that early stage ground floor opportunity, and it will start to gain traction this year, next year. Investor capital flow will come into it. The investor broker community is notorious for creating booms and then following the bust that follows. But the investor capital has not even come into industrial hemp yet. So if these booms and bust cycles happen as a natural course of business, then we are at the cusp, the early stages where industrial hemp is probably not even on the radar of many investors right now. In the next year, it probably will be on their radar. Next year or the year after, they'll be piling money into it, and they will create a boom like we've never seen before. Well, like every other cycle. And, maybe 7-8 years from now, when the industry, everyone's talking about industrial hemp and how great it is, we'll see the boom bubble blow up. And after that, there'll be a bust. To me, it doesn't matter. I understand that booms and busts happen as a part of business cycles and almost all industries, and especially the way the financial world is set up right now. But if we're at the early stages of this, it's wise to get involved now, be a part of that boom. The bust will happen, but we still have to think much, much longer term. As I said, this is going to be 20, 30 years in the making before we can really migrate most industries to hemp-based. And, these booms and busts, yeah, they happen, every few years, or 5-6 year window for the boom to happen before it becomes a bubble, and then the bust happens a year later. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter to me, because I know that 20, 30 years out, we will have this viable industrial hemp industry that's a global game changer. So that's kind of the objective, the long-term goal.
Okay, makes sense. So it sounds like there's areas for investors to get involved from a ground level perspective, but there's really no publicly traded companies that small investments can be made into.
Yeah, I've seen some companies, they've approached me to talk about the industrial hemp industry. They're looking to raise capital. I'm kind of looking at them, evaluating their business model, but it's not fitting the model that I kind of see that, it's not really their business model where they're raising capital for, doesn't address the big bottleneck that I mentioned earlier, which is the processing plant. And I've seen some companies talking about raising capital for a processing plant. I'm looking at those opportunities, but at the end of the day, this has not been built. And my time in the last year and a half has been looking at this and wrapping my head around industrial hemp and talking to manufacturers and seeing if the technology and what's required to build these processing plants. So, as much as I've talked about and looked at investments in pubcos and stock and the stock markets, I'm really now really excited to be a part of actually building an opportunity in a processing plant that's going to make this $1 trillion industry happen. So that's where I'm kind of diving into and focusing my time is identifying, and I've already identified several companies that can help build these processing plants, and we're already in discussions of what's required, talking about it. But at the end of the day, there are others out there that are talking about building a processing plant. At the end of the day, I think it makes sense that we all work together to figure out this whole bottleneck and bring that through to fruition, and then you'll have this big industry. So yeah, I'm going to start looking at more pubcos, and I'll tell you, Tia, in another 6 months to a year from now, what we're going to see is this whole industrial hemp bubble start to form, where every pubco out there that failed in cannabis, in terms of medical and rec, are now going to be talking about this whole industrial hemp industry and why their stock's going to rise, and they're going to raise tons of capital and do what they're going to do. But at the end of the day, they're there to push their stock price, just like we've heard lots of companies do over the last few years. They're not really addressing the solutions and trying to figure out the challenges and identify the companies and really build an opportunity. There'll be a lot of pump and dump, what they call pump and dump companies. We've seen them already in the cannabis space. They'll jump onto the industrial hemp bandwagon, and they'll do their pump and dump without really having a viable business or actually doing anything, just so they can make their money on their stock price. That will happen as a course of business. I'm really looking at, let's build this industrial hemp industry, because I believe it's going to be $1 trillion industry.
Okay, awesome. Well, once you have some fine choices and selections, maybe you can come back on the show and talk about your new picks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely keep you posted, and as I do dive into and research these companies, some will be the leaders, and we'll get involved with them and look.
Awesome, great. So it sounds like for people that are invested in the stock market and cannabis, you might see a marginal improvement in the returns, but it looks like essentially, what are we waiting for on those numbers to basically increase? Are we waiting for legalization within the United States to see some jump in the stock prices?
Yeah, so there's two sides to it. So we can, in the U.S., the Canadian experience has been such. We saw legalization happen earlier. We heard about it. Then companies were forming. They were building their facilities. Then once legalization happened, everything was baked into the cake. The stock prices were super high. And then at that point, the companies disappointed. So I think, and then stock prices are busting, just like we're seeing right now. I think in terms of investing in the cannabis space for medical and rec, in the U.S., we'll probably see a very similar pattern. Federally, it's illegal. At the state level, there's lots of companies operating, and they're publicly traded. As we hear the U.S. government talk about passing legislation and laws to allow legal cannabis, the stock prices will start to rise into that once legalization happens in cannabis, and all the excitement and talk around it is in all the mainstream media presses and financial news channels. You're pretty much at the peak of the market. That's when you want to sell, and maybe even short to make money on the way down. So that's still coming in the US. So there is a lot of opportunity for investing in the cannabis space, if you're looking at the US side of it, and that will come. It's actually a pretty good thing that the US sector has gotten sucked down in prices because they've gotten overvalued. But, at some point, they'll base out, they'll bottom out, you buy them then, wait until legalization happens at the federal level, and then sell into that euphoria. That's your trading opportunity on the US side. Canada side, we've already had legalization, and now we're in the bust of it, where these companies are going to have to start proving to the market that they can operate effectively, profitably, grow a quality product, and build a consumer base. So what I suspect is going to happen in Canada is we've seen the bust right now. These stocks, some of them are down 90%. Well, if you can identify the ones that are actually have traction, have customers that like their product, are operating profitably. What's going to happen is we've had Cannabis 2.0 come out in Canada, what they're calling it, which is the edibles, the beverages, the infused products. That's now available, and that market will continue to grow. But the big thing is why Canada still has some upside potential, and let's call it 100% upside from today's stock prices. Why that is available for the next 2 to 3 years is the following: is with legalization in Canada, they were able to capture 20% of the market. So 80% of the market is still in that gray area, let's call it. So as we get more retail stores online, more education, and maybe as that gray market can't compete because of branding and stuff, or maybe the government, law enforcement start cracking down on the gray market to shut them out, then you have the legal market picking up those customer bases. So can we see a point in the future where if the legal market has captured 20% of the market share of the cannabis space, and the gray market starts dying off, and we have more stores, and it's more accessible, and the licensed producers grow quality product, and there's branding around it, and people are excited to buy the branded product, can they move from 20% of the market share to 40 or 50 or 60% in the next 2 or 3 years? Absolutely. Which means, 22 or 3 more times their sales. Maybe they become profitable at that point, and their earnings justify a higher valuation. Could the stock price rise 2 or 3 times from current pricing? Absolutely. But that's, there's a lot of ifs to it, and that's 2 to 3 years in the making. I'm kind of now more focused on this whole new emerging sector in industrial hemp, which I believe is ground floor under everyone's radar and has more potential than the cannabis space. So there's money to be made in cannabis. And you also got to remember that in terms of medical or rec, we're still early stages globally. I mean, especially as a medicine. So these producers have potential, especially Canadian ones, because we are, in theory, allowed to export globally, whereas the US, you're limited to the individual state to operate. And then it makes it a little more challenging for the US companies to try to compete on a global level when Canadian companies have no issue of exporting globally, right? So you have to weigh those factors into it. But yeah, as much as we've seen this bust happen and the stock prices have come down significantly in the last year, if you were wise enough to sell in the last year at the higher prices, or you still have more capital to put to work, there is always a market that's moving somewhere. So I mean, yeah, cannabis will come back at some point. That's for sure.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. There was a lot of insight packed in there. Any last minute comments for our audience?
Yeah, no, hopefully most investors out there did not lose their shirt in the last year.
Yeah.
And if you had, well, maybe you have to get educated on investing and understand business cycles, booms and busts, and when to be investing. Education is probably the first thing you should be doing before investing, and then regroup, I guess, and try to figure it out for the next round. I mean, there's still be other opportunities to invest. So, by all means, just pay attention, and you can follow myself on LinkedIn or Invest in MJ, and I can email me if you have questions, or just follow what I write, and there'll be lots of opportunities to make money in the space. It's just where you want to put your eggs, which basket.
Right. Now, if our audience wants to kind of follow you, I believe you have a radio show or a podcast. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do different media work. So the radio show, I do it on a local radio station. It's once a week, but I'll be posting them up on cannabis-fm.com.
Okay.
The show is called Talking Cannabis, and but more so, I do most of my stuff on LinkedIn, or you can subscribe to some of my newsletters. I own a lot of web domains in the space, so I could go on about different avenues of connecting with me, but the best way is probably through LinkedIn.
Okay, fantastic. So whichever I guess link you would like to share with the audience, you can let me know, and I'll make sure that I put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, okay, definitely. I'll text you or email you that. But
perfect. Well, thank you so much for all your insight and feedback, and we look forward to hearing from you when you have your picks for the industrial hemp sector.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Tian. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.